Good morning or afternoon 9B4. This is your virtual lesson for week 4 of Inspector Calls. So you should now have completed your newspaper article. I've got lots of them that I'm shifting through, trying to do some whole class feedback for you, which should be up next week. And also the tasks that were on GCSE pod last week. So various multiple choice questions for you to answer. So this week, all of your tasks are going to be based around the lead character Eva Smith and her life. You will need to read Act 3 to begin with. So then you would have read the whole of the play. So your first task is to read Act 3. And then after you've completed that, move on to your written tasks. So task number 2. You have the question: the inspector, Mr. Burling, Sheila, Eric and Gerald all describe Eva Smith. Find a quote from each character in the text that describes her and or her background. So I've given you an example in the blue scroll there from the inspector. So he says, her position now is that she lies with a burnt out inside on a slab. So a real pleasant description of her dead body there. I would like you to find some quotes for Mr. Burling, Sheila, Eric, Gerald and the inspector, all about Eva Smith herself. So not just any old quote, they need to be specifically about Eva Smith, either in her life or maybe in her death, as I've provided you there. Now after you've done that, I then want you to do task 3, which is: what does each of your quotes tell us about the character's view of Eva Smith? So the quote that I chose from the inspector, does that show that he has sympathy for her? Does it show that he admired her maybe? Does he look at her favourably? So I've given you an example of an answer based on that quote in the blue scroll. So my example answer would be: this quote suggests that the inspector is sympathetic to Eva's plight as a desperate woman who paid the ultimate price with her life. Now many of you should be able to go on and do this extension task here in the yellow, which is highlighted. So can you identify any the language that's been chosen for effect? So in my answer here, the first part that's just in the bold text, that's the answer to the initial question: what does each of your quotes tell us about the character's view of Eva Smith? And then the yellow is the extension. So I'd like as many of you as possible to have a go at this. Even if you have a go at the extension for maybe 2 or 3 of your characters. It might be that some of you aren't sure exactly on the effect of the language that's been chosen for your quotes, but hopefully you've chosen them because you understand what they mean, they're familiar to you. So with the extension, the answer to this question now reads: this quote suggests that the inspector is sympathetic to Eva's plight as a desperate woman who paid the ultimate price with her life. So the extension: the inspector is clearly trying to provoke a reaction from the Burling family by deliberately using emotive and shocking language to describe Eva in her death. The noun slab describes where she is lying, and it has connotations of cold, stone, hard and grey. These images contrast with how we should like to imagine our dead family or friends being kept and treated after their deaths, with warmth, softness and dignity. So I've taken the noun slab, which is obviously what she's lying on here in this quote, and really picked it apart and thought, well, what images come about when you think about a slab? You know, it's often like a paving slab in your garden. It's hard, it's sometimes rough, it's got no warmth to it, often not particularly brightly coloured, and try to explain why the writer's chosen that sort of word, slab, to describe where she now lies. So that's your task 2 and task 3. Now, task 4 is to create a storyboard of Eva's life. So this is more of a creative task. I'd expect this task to probably take you at least an hour if you're going to do it well, maybe much more if you're really going to think about each of your scenes and put a real effort into the illustration or the collating of images online for your scenes. So task 4, using your knowledge of the key events and understanding of the characters during this part of the play, storyboard Eva Smith's life. So when it says this part of the play, I mean up to her suicide. I don't want you to include her suicide in this storyboard because that would just be a bit final. I'd like you to think about all the different events that led up to her suicide. So there are some rules. I'm not going to read them all out for you because there's quite a lot. But a couple that I'll pick out. The storyboard should be done in no more than 10 frames. So you could do, I would say, a minimum of 6, as you saw here. So this is an example of how you might want to lay it out. So a scene might be family gathers in dining room to celebrate Gerald and Sheila's engagement. Then you'd have your image. And underneath you might want to put some information such as the family aren't aware how all of their lives will be rocked about the news of Eva Smith, who's currently unknown in inverted commas to them. However, the inspector will arrive shortly and deliver the damning news. So I would say a minimum of 6 and a maximum of 10 frames. It does say here underneath that, ideally use roughly 1 sheet of A5 paper for each frame of your storyboard. Now I'm aware that for you at home A5 might be quite an unusual size to have. So instead of doing that, I would, here for instance, if you have your workbook, split each of your pages in 2. So then you've got 2 sort of sides of what am I trying to say? 2 sizes of A5 on your side of A4. So if you had a double page spread, you could have 4 frames on that double page spread, if that makes sense, because you'd split each of your A4 pages straight across the middle horizontally. So you've then got 2 A5s. I think that's how you make A5. So minimum of 6, maximum of 10. It just means if you do it that big, that in that size A5, you've got more room to do your illustrations and present what you want to. I want you to make sure you include speech or thought bubbles for each of the relevant characters and a brief summary outlining the plot. The other one that I think is good to highlight here is that for some of the details you'll need to use your imagination. However, guesses that you might make need to be based on what you know of the text and the context of the time. So if you were to draw a picture of the Burlings at home, in 1912, they may not have, I don't know, for instance, they wouldn't have an Alexa sat in the background of their dining room, or a television, or anything like that. Think about what they would be wearing. Obviously there would be Edna the maid, little bits like that that would demonstrate the time and the class that they are. Now, details to consider. There's quite a few here. Where might she live? What might she look like? What furniture items will be there, as we've just said. Her appearance. Request for a pay rise and Burling's refusal. How much did she ask for? How are you going to show his power and their vulnerability? The strike. Who, why, when and where. So who was it that took part in the strike? Why? Their life during the strike. So consider the fate of the workers and compare this with the Burlings. So how was Eva's life affected after she took part in the strike and then ultimately lost her job? Compared with the Burlings, what does that contrast show? Afterwards, obviously what happened to Eva, and that's then going to form most of your storyboard. Time after Millward's but before Gerald. So this is where you could use your imagination a little bit. Elaborate on what she was doing before she met Gerald. When she met Gerald, what would she have thought and felt at this meeting? Would she have been overjoyed that she met such a lovely, kind man, supposedly? And then when Gerald leaves, how did she feel? So you'll need to decide on what subjects or what scenes your storyboard will cover. So I might choose to do... I'd probably start at the strike at the Burling's factory. Then I would do her life after the strike. Then when she got the job at Millwoods, and you could include in that with Sheila's, the altercation she had with Sheila and her mum, Mrs. Burling. Then what did she turn to try and make money after she was sacked from Millwoods? What was her life like with Gerald? Then when she met Eric, then maybe I would probably try and do up to the 10. Then after Eric, what happened when Eric and her then broke up? She was left pregnant. She went to Mrs. Burling's charity. That would be quite a nice one to storyboard. And then how would you leave that? So if you're not going to actually storyboard her suicide, would you leave it? Could your last scene be that she's left the charity after being refused any help financially or otherwise? How is she left feeling? So you could be quite imaginative and creative with that one. So just to recap, storyboard, minimum of 6, maximum of 10 frames. Make sure you use speech and thought bubbles and a brief summary outlining the plot or the change of settings. Don't include the suicide, so right up until that point. Use your imagination. Consider all these details here when you're deciding on your 6 to 10 storyboard frames. And ideally do it so each of your storyboard squares is around the size of A5. Now once you've worked your way through that, which should take a considerable amount of time, if some of you are still feeling that you want to do a bit more work, it's some extension tasks. So first task is to consider the play as a classical Greek drama. So this is task 5, extension. Now in a Greek drama, traditionally, you'd have 5 roles. You've probably heard of some of these before: a protagonist, an antagonist, a deuteragonist, an anti-hero and a foil. So if you read through what all of those are, I then want you to draw a table like so and explore these character roles in terms of the play. So you've got a list here of all the different characters in the play. I'd like you to decide which role these characters might be if it was a classic Greek play. So would they be a protagonist or an antagonist, etc. And then why? So if we look at In Spectacle, so which of these roles do you think he would have? I would suggest that he's a protagonist, so he's the lead hero. He is the character that comes into the play, into the Burling's life, delivers the revelation that this girl is dead, and then explains how. And he certainly comes across as the hero for many reasons, but what are those reasons? Why does he come across as so wonderful and great and heroic compared to the Burlings? Okay. And then you'd want to decide on which of the other roles from the Greek play do each of these characters fulfill and why. So that's your first extension task. Now once you finish that, if you fancy doing something else, you've got a super extension task, which is task 6. I can add as well, if you don't want to do task 5 but you fancy task 6, just do that. You don't have to do all of them. You don't have to do task 5 to do task 6, but either of these are extension tasks. Ideally do both. That would be wonderful. Okay, so task 6, I'd like you to answer this question. Does J.B. Priestley's message and the character of Eva Smith still have a place in society in 2020? Who would Eva Smith be in today's society and why? So, does Eva Smith have echoes of today? Who might her character be today? Are there any roles in society, particularly maybe at the moment given the current pandemic and the consequences for people of different cultures, in different countries, in different financial situations? Who might she be today? So let's just have a think of who she was in the play, supposedly in 1912. So she was a young woman who maybe didn't have a career as such, but certainly had a good job working in the factory. She then felt that she should be paid more, her and her fellow female workers, so they started a strike. Consequently, she was seen as antagonistic, so she was sacked. After that, she got another job at Millwoods, which looked like quite a nice job, working in a hat shop and clothes shop. She was then sacked from that. She then turned to a life on the streets, possibly prostitution, where she met Gerald. So she's a woman that's down on her luck. She's a woman that's hit hard times and turns to, you know, a not a very nice way to make money to survive. So can we think of how that could resonate today? So are we still in a situation where even though we have a welfare state, people still don't have enough money to survive? Think about things like food banks. You might be aware of issues with access to certain benefits, or the lack of access, and how that affects people, particularly if you're a single parent and you have a family to feed. So she wasn't a parent at the time, but she certainly became pregnant and then needed help. So does it have a resonance today? Can we find characters like Eva Smith in today's society? So that's a little essay task, really. You could write as much or as little as you like for that, but I would say that could take you off into quite a rabbit hole and you'd have a lot to write about, I hope. So I look forward to receiving some answers to that. That's quite an interesting question. So finally, this is due on Thursday the 21st of May, so that's a week today. If you've got any questions about any of the tasks, as always, please give me an email or a message on Teams. I hope you're all well and look forward to receiving your work. So take care, thanks, bye.